Hello everyone, happy Tuesday and welcome to today's regulatory roundup where Jimmy and I will be looking back at some of the more interesting and noteworthy regulatory developments impacting the global payments industry over the last month. June 2024, across the 140 jurisdictions monitored by Vixio's Horizon Scanning tool, bit quieter than May. There were 127 new regulatory updates relevant to the global payments industry, 43 of which our analysts deemed to be actionable. In addition to that, in terms of regulatory deadlines, we saw 29 new laws and regulations come into effect and 20 consultations close. It's also a month, that's probably no surprise to many of you, that saw several elections, not to mention Iceland, Mexico, Belgium, Bulgaria. We saw a big shift to the right in the EU parliamentary elections, question marks over whether Joe Biden will stand for a second term, and the final weeks of campaigning in the UK before we, of course, head to the polls this Thursday. I mention this because in addition to the new regulations coming out, the tectonic plates that influence the future direction of policy are also changing at an unprecedented pace. Identifying all relevant forthcoming regulatory risks and opportunities, I don't know about you, Jimmy, but it seems to be as challenging as ever for people out there.
Absolutely.
Which is good for us anyway. So over the next 30 minutes or so, the two of us are going to be unpacking some of these. As always, departed from the UK via Europe into Asia before finishing in the Americas. So if we start in the UK, Jimmy, and obviously we've got an election coming up in the next couple of days, but one thing that was, I suppose, another change in leadership was at the PSR, where shortly after sort of the sudden departure of Chris Hemsley, the now former chief of the PSR, lobbyists argued that the industry needs more time to adapt to the new APP fraud rules. They kind of argue that there wasn't enough time to properly implement this, and this would essentially cause a lot of disruption in the industry. I think since then, the PSR have kind of come back and said that the timeline is not moving, it's staying the same. And they don't really want anything to stand in the way of progress. I think there's obviously a lot of urgency around APP fraud being such a huge problem. Delaying it by a year, it's not going to benefit anyone. I think the industry is saying, well, if you're going to implement something like this, we need to make sure it's done in the right way.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this debate really highlights the tension between regulatory bodies seeking to strengthen consumer protection and industry groups that are concerned about the practical implications of the new regulation. One thing I think that I've noticed people talking about is, well, one thing I've really noticed actually from being at Money 2020 and EBA Day recently is the international shock at these regulations. People think it's absolutely crazy if they're not in the UK, and I think people in the UK think it's crazy as well. That's something, like, my view on that is not necessarily that that's the case, but I think people think it's the PSR has definitely been a bit of a first mover here in dealing with this. And I think also the reason why it's been quite difficult with PSR is this is the first time they really face a lot of flack. Like the Bank of England and the Financial Conduct Authority, for example, have faced plenty of situations over the years where they've got negative headlines in City AM or the Financial Times, for example. The PSR never really has. It's kind of flown under the radar a lot of the time. And this is the first time they really kind of definitely had a lot of pushback from the press and also from the firms that they supervise. All eyes for me are on what happens after the election. I've noticed lobbyists definitely becoming much friendly with Labour over the last few years. And I wonder whether what will happen if Tulip Sadiq, who's going to be the new City Minister, if Labour, as expected, win on Thursday, will she be very sympathetic towards the payment industry's concerns? And, will we also see the payment systems regulator bow to the pressure and push back that date over the summer? I think that's definitely going to be interesting to watch out for. Politically, I think app scams are definitely something that comes up with MPs a lot. If you're the MP for Bognor, I say that because it's my hometown, and I've noticed Bognor Regis Matters, there being some concerns about fraud recently on the Facebook page. And you keep getting constituents coming to you and moaning about something like fraud, and particularly fraud that's happening on stuff like Facebook or other social media sites. If you look at the stuff that the Home Affairs Select Committee has been doing with the fraud inquiry that ended with the snap election being called, they've definitely been quite concerned about big tech firms and what they're doing to tackle fraud. And you really get the feeling that MPs, particularly in the last intake, and I don't think that's going to change with the next intake, don't think that big tech firms are doing enough. So one thing I wonder is whether we could see perhaps this regulation being put on ice, or perhaps being changed slightly, because Labour may make big tech firms and telecoms firms liable for reimbursement. And my prediction for the next year is we're going to see some kind of consultation drop from the Treasury or from the Culture and Media and Sport Department outlining how reimbursement should change and whether big tech firms should be involved in that. I think one way we could see is a fraud levy, which is what the Home Affairs Select Committee were calling for. Another thing we could see is liability coming for the social media firms in the same way that it currently is the payments firms and banks. And I think that would be following the EU with the PSR if MEPs get their way, as we discussed before.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of focus on liability and reimbursement, but I think at the root of this, prevention is the thing that's really going to tackle it. And we'll come on a little bit later to what Singapore are doing in that respect, but they brought something in that I think is potentially we could see kind of imitated across other jurisdictions. We'll get onto that a bit later. Staying in the UK, a couple of weeks ago, the UK Competition Appeal Tribunal ruled to allow lawsuits against Visa and MasterCard over interchange fees to proceed. Obviously, this isn't a unique thing to the UK. This is being echoed around the world. I think it's significant because it paves the way for numerous claims related to these fees, which businesses, obviously argue are unfair and anti-competitive. I think various businesses, retailers, merchants have brought forward these claims. They're essentially, arguing that the high interchange fees imposed by Visa and MasterCard are unfairly inflating their costs, and ultimately that's being passed on to the consumer. I think it depends. It sort of remains what's to be seen here, whether that's a fine or some sort of compensation or some sort of fee adjustment. I think it is unclear at this stage. I think it could be one, two, or all three of those things. We've seen sort of a variety of enforcement against the kind of duopoly there. But I think just in general, it signals a bit of a shift towards kind of greater accountability for major financial services providers, and highlights the importance of kind of fair competition in the market.
Yeah, definitely.
And is it the US where this is also, there was a big case recently, I think, in the US against Visa and MasterCard on.
Well, in the last few days, I've noticed that a district judge in the US has thrown out a settlement on swipe fee charges for Visa and MasterCard. I think there's some other cases that have happened as well in the US. So it's definitely an international issue. And I think when I've spoken to the people who are bringing forward this lawsuit in the UK, they have mentioned the US as well as showing that this isn't something that's going to go away for Visa and MasterCard. Visa and MasterCard obviously make the argument that interchange fees have to be charged because it is a service that they're providing to merchants. So there is two sides to this story. I think we've seen these tribunals taking place in the UK for quite some time now. Definitely in the time I've been at Vixio, I feel like I've been covering them quite a lot. You have a Walter Merrick's case, for example. And I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens next year when this case does come to the CAT tribunal, seeing as or the CAT court, seeing as it's now able to go forward. We are, or I should say, watch this space, because I think we're also going to see action happening in some other European countries. And this isn't something that's going away for the EU. So you have got the, I think the EU recently sent out a questionnaire on the implementation of the interchange fee regulation. So I think interchange fees continue to be quite a pertinent issue across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can actually track any regulatory changes relating specifically to interchange fees in Vixio's Horizon Scanning tool. Just get that plug in there. Staying in the UK, finally, we also notice, I suppose, a semi-victim of the impending snap election being called is the review of the treatment of PEPs will not be published now at the end of June. The regulator essentially said they're waiting until after the general election to publish its findings. Which is sort of to be expected, I suppose. I think, for those that are not familiar with the matter, this all kind of follows on from Nigel Farage's Coutts bank account being closed. So I think there are a lot of people interested to see the outcome of this, but also not hugely surprising they've kind of delayed the results there due to the election.
I mean, when I speak to people in the payments industry, they all thought that the Nigel Farage backlash was a bit of a lot of hot air, basically.
Yeah.
And I think one thing, I think there's definitely a discussion to be had, because, for example, not-for-profits and charities and think tanks really struggle to get bank accounts and really struggle with getting that bank account shut down as well in the UK. And at times with the PEPs, I know that MPs are very passionate about this, because, I mean, MPs' cousins at times can get refused a bank account for having that kind of involvement. So I think there's definitely a story there, and it's going to be interesting to watch what the FCA advises needs to happen. And I know that the Treasury, before the snap election as well, were consulting on changes that needs to happen to the payment account rules in the UK.
Right. And now crossing the channel over to Europe. As always, we want to touch on what's happening with MiCA implementation. And one thing that stood out for me in the data actually is that in our Horizon Scanning tool, there were 32 new regulatory updates in June. That's compared to about an average of about 8 per month in 2024 so far. I think there's a few things kind of driving this increase in activity. Per Article 60 of MiCA, questionnaires are now being sent out by several competent authorities across France, Italy, Germany, Norway, Sweden, Croatia, Luxembourg, etc., essentially asking entities with current authorization to notify their intent to provide services falling within the scope of MiCA. Most of them have set a deadline for July the 26th to get those responses in. And in addition to that, we've seen now draft laws in Austria and Croatia, and new laws being passed to implement aspects of MiCA in Estonia, Latvia, and Sweden, with many of these also containing provisions relating to DORA 2. On the subject of DORA, we also saw the European Commission publish 3 new sets of regulatory technical standards, and the Dutch Authority for Financial Markets said there is actually quite a lot of variance in the preparedness amongst firms for DORA. I think this owes in part to that it's kind of like, it doesn't matter how big you are, you've got to comply with DORA. And some of these firms have enormous budgets, massive resources, entire teams dedicated to this. And, some companies, that's just simply not feasible, and they're trying to muddle their way through it. So again, that's not hugely surprising. Sorry, what were you going to say?
I can say with DORA, I think that there's largely a lot of positivity in the financial services industry about its implementation, because people think it makes sense to have operational resilience, obviously. But definitely, banks have had to deal with cybersecurity rules for a very long time. Payments and money firms, not so much. So it's definitely way more of a shock for them, and crypto firms as well, which I think regulators are starting to appreciate in the implementation phase.
Yeah. And just finally on MiCA, one thing that kind of on reflection really that we've seen that's going to kind of make this a more complicated environment, certainly in Europe for firms with cross-border aspirations, is you've got this variation in implementation timeframes due to this grandfather clause. So some countries will go up till July 1st, 2026 under their national laws. That means that during that period, passporting rights under MiCA are not applicable unless both countries allow it during that transition. Others may implement it on December the 31st, 2024. Yeah. So you've got this 18-month window where you're going to have this arbitrage. You can passport here, you can't passport there. I think that's going to make it incredibly complicated for lots of businesses, and really the only way to get around that is to just pay really close attention to what's happening and the approach each European member state takes in that respect. Again, something easily done on Vixio's Horizon Scanning platform. We also saw in the EU last week the Council adopted another round of sanctions against Russia, added 69 individuals and 47 entities to the list. These measures target those undermining Ukraine's sovereignty, including business people, propagandists, military personnel, judiciary members, those involved in dual-use technologies and weapon transport, organizations involved in the deportation and re-education of Ukrainian children. Compliance protocols really, for firms have to be updated to prevent sanctioned parties from using payment systems. I think overall the EU sanctions now impact about 2,200 individuals and entities that are linked to Ukraine. As part of that sanctions package, they also imposed sanctions on 6 individuals undermining Sudan's stability amid ongoing conflicts there. And the Council also approved sanctions on 6 individuals for cyber attacks targeting critical infrastructure and state functions in EU member states. So, if you're in a sanctions compliance role, there's a few different things to look out for there and update.
No, absolutely. And I think one thing that we've definitely noticed in our Outlook reports before is the impact of these sanctions on compliance professionals, because they've suddenly had to, deal with updates that are happening every few months since the global conflicts that have happened, such as with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think it's still a very big deal.
Absolutely. And I don't think it's going away either, especially with all these elections. And actually on that point of elections as well. So I think one of the big things where the payments industry is confirmed is the previous European election saw 2 key MEPs involved in drafting the EU payments legislation losing their seats. I think that's created a lot of uncertainty for the feeder regulations and some uncertainty around the PSR as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So Michael Hugin, who was very popular with the payments industry after the instant payments regulation, and Marek Belka, the rapporteur, who was the rapporteur for the payment services regulation, has also lost his seat. Very popular with people as well. So they're going to have to be there's going to have to be new rapporteurs going into the negotiation phase. The PSR and PSD3 have been agreed by, or the position has been agreed by MEPs. I don't think they're going to revisit it, but they are going to have to find new people to go and do those negotiations. With Andrej Kavarik, who has got his seat back and was the rapporteur for PSD3, his group in Czechia has basically decided to leave the Renew group, which is the centrist wing of the European Parliament. And that means there is some uncertainty over whether he will continue as rapporteur for the PSD3, which I think many people in the payments industry are going to be pretty gutted about, because he was seen as very sensible and a safe pair of hands. He had a lot of involvement with the MiCA legislation, for example. So it's going to be all change for people having to basically familiarise themselves with new MEPs. I think it's something like 60% of members of the European Parliament are new now. So there's going to be a lot of change on the Econ committee when dealing with these files. And you also got the digital euro and FIDA, which have taken a bit more time to come to a decision on. I wonder, with the shift for right that you're mentioning, well, what that's going to mean for digital euro. Le Pen's party, for example, in France, not exactly enthusiastic about the euro. Are they going to be enthusiastic about digital euro? It's going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, and I think with an example of that kind of geopolitics impacting regulations and this sort of shift to the right, I think there's going to be a bigger emphasis around sovereignty in the EU. We've even seen it in the US, like certain states have even passed, I can't remember the state it was I saw last week, passed a piece of legislation banning CBDCs. And there's been examples of that in a few states now. So it's where you've got this, sort of slightly right-leaning political stance that doesn't marry well with CBDCs at all.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it'd be interesting to see how this plays out over the next kind of year or so. Now, hopping over, actually, we're going to go down under. I thought this was quite interesting because so the Reserve Bank of Australia may soon require card networks to disclose their scheme fees to enhance transparency. Ellis Connolly, the RBA's head of payments policy, noted the rise in scheme fees is increasing merchant costs without regulation. Unlike interchange fees, scheme fees are paid by the issuers and acquirers to card networks and operators. They rose 43%. To $1.9 billion in 2022-2023. And the RBA has essentially highlighted a lack of transparency and the burden on acquirers who pass that cost on to merchants. Australia's Treasury is considering reforms to the Payment Systems Regulation Act to address modern payment systems. And I think there are similar regulatory concerns, like there is in the UK, to suggest potential for scheme fee regulations akin to interchange fee caps as well.
Yeah, I wonder whether we're going to see Australia jump ahead of the UK and actually introduce scheme fee regulations, which I think many merchants would rejoice at if they did it. So it's going to be interesting to see where Australia comes to a conclusion on that, and certainly if they do it, how people in the UK and EU, where there's lots of lobbying for there to be scheme fee interventions, or how they react to it as well.
Yeah, but again, it's more sort of adversity for the card schemes as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, interesting to see how the business models will adapt as that regulation evolves. The other thing that was notable in Australia last month actually is the buy now pay later sector there is set for regulation, similar to other credit products following the introduction of the Treasury Laws Amendment Bill. This bill, which was introduced by Stephen Jones, aims to amend the National Consumer Credit Protection Act and its regulations, which essentially bring buy now pay later providers under the same framework as other credit providers. They'll essentially need to obtain an Australian credit license, and the bill classifies buy now pay later contracts as low cost credit contracts, or LCCCs. And there are specific regulations based on the credit limits as well. Again, this is something that potentially we've been anticipating for some time. Buy now, pay later starting to be regulated like other consumer credit.
I mean, we're seeing it the world over. Buy now, pay later regulation is getting closer each day for a lot of these firms. And Australia has definitely jumped ahead of other jurisdictions in actually doing it. I think in the UK, for example, if Labour get in, they've said they're definitely going to do this. It wasn't in the manifesto, but I would expect them to jump ahead with that. I think really what regulators and governments are trying to do is find the balance between this benefit to consumers who often will pay their buy now pay later payments on time. For example, I was recently needing a new suit for a wedding. I found buy now pay later very helpful for that. But then also balancing it with the harms to vulnerable customers and the need to stop it just being an entirely unregulated space. So yeah, we're definitely going to see more happening there, and it'll be interesting to see with Australia how these regulations pan out for the industry.
Yeah, and I guess also, obviously Labour are ahead in the polls in the UK. They've kind of touted a bit in the past that they might bring in buy now pay later regulation in the UK as well. So maybe we could see that here. I think generally, certainly the bigger players in the industry are kind of welcome it to some degree.
They really want it
because it actually removes any kind of negative press away from them being these kind of unregulated sort of Wild West credit providers. And I think a bit like Mika, what it's doing in the crypto space, maybe you'll have the smaller players that are operating in a slightly kind of, I guess, high risk manner, and you might see a rationalization in the market, essentially.
We've seen firms like Klarna be incredibly vocal about the want for regulation in the UK and in the EU as well. And I think that people want that certainty that comes with compliance rather than having to wait for a long time to work out, because they know regulation is going to come at some point. I think they'd rather just know what they need to do than have to kind of wait and potentially invest in things that they're going to find out actually they can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving slightly north, and this is what I wanted to mention earlier, was Singapore. So Singapore has imposed ID verification requirements on Facebook Marketplace sellers to protect users from being scammed, potentially setting a trend, I think, that might extend to other jurisdictions. So this is part of the Online Criminal Harms Act, or OCHA, I'm going to call it, which came into effect on Monday, June the 24th. And essentially it imposes obligations on social media and e-commerce platforms. Under these new rules, Facebook Marketplace and Facebook advertisements will have to verify the identities of all risky sellers by the end of 2024. And what I quite like about this is that there's like a sort of a sensible step that they've put in there to say, if the verification of these sellers doesn't lead to a significant drop in reported scam activity, then the platforms will have to verify all sellers by Easter 2025. So I think that's quite a sensible two-step process there. And again, it's tackling and targeting prevention rather than reimbursement, which I quite like. I also noted from that the Facebook pages will also be required to verify risky sellers, but that requirement's been put on hold so that Facebook can prioritize ID verification for marketplaces and the advertisements. I just think that's quite an interesting development that we'll probably see elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we could see jurisdictions like the UK and EU looking to Singapore for inspiration on this. Because one of the things I actually noticed with the EU, so MEPs want this reimbursement to be put in for social media firms. But I heard recently at EBA Day a senior EU official basically shutting that down and saying they didn't think that was a good idea, and that MEPs need to pay attention to other pieces of regulation that make it quite challenging to do that. So I mean, I wonder whether we're going to see something like there's rumours that the EU could bring out a fraud strategy similar to the retail payment strategy they brought out a few years ago. Could we see something like that coming in there that takes inspiration from Singapore with this?
Yeah, and tangential to that in Singapore, we've also seen new obligations put on the likes of WhatsApp, Instagram, Facebook, Telegram, and WeChat that they categorize as online communication services, or high-risk online communication services, I should say. And essentially this means they'll have to implement codes of practice and processes around sharing information with law enforcement agencies. Again, this is all around tackling fraud, and doing it on those platforms. There is going to be a point where they're going to have to meet some predetermined kind of scam fighting goals as well. So again, just Singapore taking a very kind of direct approach, I think, to fraud prevention there. Now moving across to the US, on June the 5th, the CFPB issued a final rule establishing the criteria for recognizing standard setting bodies for open banking. I think this is going to be critical to align with the personal financial data rights rule. They basically said recognized bodies must be fair, open and inclusive, ensure a secure and competitive data access framework. It emphasized that industry-led standard setting adapts better to market and technological changes than federal regulations, which I think given the kind of regulatory environment over there makes a lot of sense. To be recognized, standard setting bodies must demonstrate openness, balance, due process, consensus, and transparency. And this progress signifies a move towards implementing open banking in the US, which I think again people are excited about and welcoming.
Yeah, absolutely. It's going to be. I mean, are we going to see the CFPB and its open banking proposals become a victim of a potential Trump presidency? I think that's what I'm hearing a bit from people.
Really?
But people are very enthusiastic about the personal financial data rights. They see it as a great first step towards open banking in the US.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose also on that topic of open banking, we saw Canada's Bill C-69 enact the Consumer Driven Banking Act, essentially open banking, and it establishes a framework for consumers, where they can essentially choose to share their data securely among participating entities, banks, credit unions, etc. So again, really exciting developments over there. I think lastly, again, we'll just pick up on the buy now, pay later thing, because we saw the CFPB also come out and say a little bit more around how they're going to bring buy now, pay later in line with other credit providers. So currently there is some federal and state oversight, but the regulations vary. In May, they issued an interpretive rule clarifying that many credit card rules also apply to buy now, pay later products. Rohit Chopra, who leads the CFPB, has now urged more authority to supervise buy now, pay later companies fully. Senator Jack Reed has supported greater federal supervision to address regulatory gaps and ensure buy now, pay later loans are also included in credit reports. But again, like an example of what we were talking about earlier, a firm who's a major buy now, pay later provider welcomes the consistent standards and regulation.
Yeah.
And they highlighted their commitment to transparency and compliance. So again, I think, if you're a big player in an industry, you want regulatory clarity and certainty. And I think we'll see more of this.
No, 100%.
We're almost out of time. So if there's things that, you think we haven't covered today, you'll be absolutely right. Given the sheer volume of change in regulation across the global payments industry, even if it is summer, it would be impossible for us to cram all of this into one session. And that's why the world's leading payments businesses use Vixio to aggregate, translate, and summarize regulatory updates from across the globe into one single source of truth. Feel free to get in touch with me to learn more about that. Otherwise, we'll see you back here in a month's time for July's regulatory roundup. And until then, stay compliant, everyone. Bye-bye.
See you later. Bye.